Well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to this evening's meeting of the Scrutiny and Policy Overview Committee. I'm Councillor David Jones, and I am the Vice Chairman of the committee. Councillor Jameson is unfortunately in hospital at the moment, having various bits twiddled with, and therefore I shall be chairing the meeting this evening. Now, I know members and officers have their names in front of them for reference, but it's not always possible on the camera to distinguish them. So for the camera, can I ask members and officers present to identify themselves, starting with Councillor Hilliard.
Thank you, Chairman. Yeah, Paul Hilliard, Councillor for Muddyford and Friescliffe Ward.
Wendy Grace, Councillor for Town Centre Ward.
Councillor Fred Neal, Jumpers Ward.
Lee Ellis, Scrutiny Officer. Nikki Hooley, Democratic Services Officer.
I'm also the Councillor for the West Highcliffe Ward.
Lillian Broad, Apprentice.
I'm Denise Jones, Councillor for Grange Ward.
Janet Abbott, Councillor for Grange Ward.
In order to assist in the process this evening, I must ask everyone to ensure that mobile phones are either switched off, or, because we do appreciate that some people have to be contactable, they're set to silent ring. We would be grateful if one member of the public here would remain quiet whilst the meeting is in progress. I would like to remind everyone present that this meeting will be filmed by the Council and broadcast live on the internet and will be capable of repeated viewing. If you are seated in the chamber, it is possible that the cameras will capture your image. By your presence, you are deemed to consent to be filmed and to the use of those images and sound recordings for webcasting and/or training purposes. As the chairman of the meeting, I can, at my discretion, terminate or suspend filming if, in my opinion, continuing to do so would prejudice the proceedings of the meeting, or if I consider that continued filming might infringe the rights of any individual or breach any statutory provision. Finally, there are no fire drills planned for this evening, so if the fire alarm sounds, please evacuate the building immediately via the emergency exit. That concludes the legal announcement, so we'll now move on to the agenda. But before we do move on to the apologies, one of the apologies, as I said, is Councillor Jameson, and that's why I'm chairing the meeting. So we would need a vice chairman for the rest of the meeting. Can I, from the chair, propose Councillor Paul Hilliard? Do I see a seconder? That is seconded. Councillor Hilliard, you have a choice of which to. Yeah, you're happy to sit there? Right. Okay. So we now move on to apologies.
Thank you, Chairman. As you said, Councillor Jameson has given his apologies, Councillor Smith and Councillor Watts.
Very much. Can I ask the committee, would it be appropriate for the committee to send our best wishes to Councillor Jameson and hope that he is out of hospital soon and back to us? Okay, so can you look after that? Thank you. Are there any declarations of interest on the material before us? No. So the next item, I will though say, for purposes of transparency, that I am one of the two Dorset County Council representatives on the committee. This is not in any way a prejudicial interest, but I state it for the purposes of transparency. Okay. So we now move on to the only item for this special meeting, which is to consider the minutes and the proceedings of the last meeting of the Bournemouth, Christchurch and Poole Joint Committee. Now, there were a number of quite juicy items on this. I think members have all had the at least pages 1 to 10 circulated, because I circulated them. Unfortunately, I didn't realise that there were pages 11 and 12, so it may be that some members haven't got the last 2 pages, but I'm pleased to say they are all in the booklet here. So,
Chairman, for clarity,
yeah.
are we not talking about the minutes of this meeting?
So we are talking about the minutes of the
Scrutiny.
One second on this one, please. It is not normally the practice to confirm minutes at an extraordinary meeting. They are, I believe, there for members to for the use of members' information. But with the groups or with the committee's permission, I would prefer to leave these until the next proper meeting of the committee. We are a little thin on the ground, and I think it would be more appropriate to deal with them at that point. So with your permission, members, I will defer that item till the next meeting.
As I brought it up, I'm happy with that.
Thank you. Okay, so now can we move on to the minutes of the Bournemouth Pool and Christchurch, or Bournemouth, Christchurch and Pool Joint Committee. Now, Councillor Jameson at the last meeting set what I consider to be a very acceptable precedent, that we should look at the various points that are in the minutes and comment on them. The purpose of this is that our comments should then be passed on to the next meeting of the Bournemouth Pool and Dorset Joint Committee, which is a week yesterday. So again, this will be up to the administrator and the scrutiny officer to sort out. So what I intend to do, subject to members' clarification, is to go through the various points, and I don't think there's anything really crunchy before we come to item 28. Apart from the fact that he said, being pedantic, clause 16 of the minutes is of course incorrect. That should be paragraph 16 of the minutes. A clause being a system of words that has a verb but no subject, and this is the there are more than one, there are a number of complete sentences, so that of course should be a paragraph 16. So we now move on to these points, item 28. Now, members, I am concerned about this. Is a matter for concern, and I, as a member of the committee, as the Dorset County Council member there, not when I said I asked for clarification, so I could not find reference in the minutes of the Joint Committee that the above constitution had been agreed as the relevant standing orders. Now, I have no problem, as we know, things happen, things should be put forward, particularly when you're dealing with a new committee and a new joint committee. But I had in front of me, when I raised that point, the minutes of the first meeting of the committee. I had in front of me my manuscript notes of that meeting, and nowhere did it say that the committee had agreed to adopt the constitution of the Bournemouth Borough Council. Now, this is, I think, very unfortunate for 2 reasons. of the three councils, our council is the one which has the most generous and most open allowance for questions and for public speaking. I would have thought that a new council going forward would have been very concerned to put a picture of a council that was open and transparent. What you've got, I am afraid, is a council that seems to be determined to operate with as little reference to the public, and this is my personal view, as possible. Now, members will recall that members of this council had submitted questions to the Joint Committee. They were told that it was not acceptable as they had other ways of putting these things forward. Now, that has been remedied. I'd like to thank our officers, and in particular Richard Jones, for putting this forward. You will have had an email from him saying that now members can put forward this. But the second point is this. The minutes here say that she indicated that the committee were able to reaffirm the use of the relevant standing orders. You can't reaffirm something if you haven't affirmed it in the first place. To my mind, the correct procedure would have been to have brought a motion to this group or to the next meeting to say that they adopt, for the purposes of debate and such like, they adopt the relevant clauses of the Bournemouth Borough Council Constitution. They didn't. They operated a procedure which one or two members of the public commented to me afterwards gave a very unsavoury opinion of how that committee was going to work. So I think we should express our concern that this was not done properly, it was not done openly, and it does contain, to my mind and to the mind of, and I think other people who've been there, an incorrect reading of history. And this is a very, very bad sign, in my opinion. Councillor Abbott.
It's just a point, but can we confirm that our leader and deputy leader have actually read the Constitution for Bournemouth? Have other members been shown this? Has it been circulated? How could it be approved if nobody's read it?
Fortunately, we have our deputy leader here. Are you able to comment on that? No copy of the... I don't remember hearing it. Yeah. Yeah. Councillor Mrs. Jones.
Deputy leader, who is one of our two representatives on this committee, to be sitting at the table.
Are you members, are you happy with that? And Councillor Phipps is also a reserve member for the County Council. Yeah, okay. Councillor Jamieson, would you like to join us? Not necessarily in the hot seat, but one of the... Thank you. Thank you, Councillor Mrs. Jones. So, press the right button. Are the committee happy that we make that point to the Joint Committee? Thank you. So, we now move on to the recommendations from the overview and scrutiny panels. Are there any points members would like to raise on this? Councillor Mrs. Jones.
In reference to the first section of 29, Mr. Chairman, the task and finish group, or the overview and scrutiny panel, it was decided that, or recommended, the task and finish group on civic functions includes some consultation with present and past mayors to inform its recommendations. May I ask, do we know, do they mean all existing past and present mayors of all three authorities, or is it going to be a hand-picked selection?
I very much hope that it will mean the past and present mayors of all three authorities, and I'm sure that we can raise that point with the joint committee. Are there any?
Should I declare an interest? I am a past mayor and I've not been invited as yet.
Councillor Hilliard.
Thank you, Chairman. So obviously last time, I think our overview and scrutiny meeting was on the day, 2 days before, and we didn't get the minutes in time to hit that. Are the officers comfortable that they meet the deadline for next week?
The role that we've got in is to present the notes, and last time they were presented to Councillor Flagg and Councillor Jameson to feed back to the meeting. Obviously, I don't know if that happened. Councillor Jameson, I'm sure, can form on that. But the role is for us to pass that on, because the agreement you had was to have the meeting, come up with any comments, and then for your members that are on the committee to present those back. Obviously, we present a paper copy of it, but we don't formally send it to the Democratic Services team.
There will be an exciting workshop in the afternoon of following the next meeting on the 15th, and I am desperately sorry that I shall be excluded from this as a county councillor representative, and I congratulate Councillor Jameson on her good fortune in being able to attend. What time's confession on Sunday? We now move on to and we're getting now onto the points where I think these two, or this minute and one other, are likely, I think, to cause some concern. And this is the Consolidated Medium-Term Financial Plans. Now, I think the best thing I can do is to ask members to glance through these and to come up with any questions and queries that we might have on this, because, as I said, we are getting to the point where things are likely to be getting controversial, and you'll see that there were a number of comments and questions that were raised. Councillor Hilliard.
Thank you, Chairman. Just for clarification, and probably might be Mr. Milner more appropriate, but are we just in figure 1 where we're just capturing the positions, the MTFP positions now? So we're ignoring any merger benefit savings, anything like that. It's just the position now, and then they're just accumulated for each of those, and then similar position for Dorset County in figure 2. It's a position now rather than after future Dorset is implemented.
I think it might be helpful if Mr. Milner would like to join us.
Thank you, Chairman. Good evening, members. Yes, that's correct. It is as the position is now before any change occurs and any saving as a result of unitarisation occurs.
I think there's likely to be quite a few questions, Mr. Milner. So, Councillor Abbott.
It's the question of the shadow authority. Can we clarify who they are and who elected them, appointed them, whatever? We're getting questions from the public. How is this going? What's going on? And we really need to be able to tell them about the setup we have here now.
Thank you, Chairman. Yeah, the shadow authority will be all the members of the existing councils.
Isn't it the case that the shadow authority won't actually be created until the order is finally engrossed, I think is the word?
That's my understanding. I will just confirm that with the Chief Exec. That's correct.
Are there further questions? I have some questions, but at one point, are there any further questions? Councillor Neal.
I did read through this, and further on, talking about the who are the people on the shadow committee, it does say that they've already been nominated and how they were nominated on page 11. On page 11, it says, third paragraph, which members were nominated and elected to the shadow executive committee. So do we not know who they are?
Councillor Neal, we have some papers, some copies are numbered at the top and the bottom, and there's a difference between them. For clarity, which paragraph are we looking at? Page 35. 11 at the top.
11 at the top, third paragraph down, it says, the monitoring officer, in response to the question, reported that a further report will be submitted in January, setting out the proposals on the way in which members were nominated and elected to the shadow executive committee. So surely that's been done.
Perhaps Mr. McIntosh could clarify that.
Happily, Chairman, it's not been done. It's a badly worded minute, I believe. So there would be a shadow authority, as Mr. Milner said, made up of the members of all the members of the constituent councils, and then that shadow authority would have a shadow executive made up of, we believe at the moment, representatives of each of the constituent authorities. And the original idea of establishing a joint committee is that would be very similar to what would follow in terms of the executive arrangement.
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, I can't find it just for a second, but there was a proposal about it being politically balanced, and that vote never got taken. So, do we know whether it will be politically balanced or not? Because I'd like to feel that, you know, democracy does work.
I think, and I'm sure the Chief Executive will correct me if I'm wrong, that insofar as the actual legal shadow authority will be composed of every single councillor, elected councillor for first and second tier authorities, automatically that will reflect the political balance. However, if my memory serves me right, it was pointed out that it is desired that there be an executive committee, if you like, for the shadow authority. It can't be a cabinet because the members won't have any jurisdiction over the day-to-day running of the authority, but that the actual business of the authority will be by and large, I think, almost exclusively transacted by that executive committee. The choosing of that, how that executive committee is formed, is, I suspect, a matter for some debate later down the line, because I do know that our members dissented quite strongly from the proposal by Bournemouth and Poole. But I think that will have to be reported at the next committee meeting, so we will get to see that in 4 weeks' time. Have you anything to clarify on that, Mr. McIntosh?
Just to say, Chairman, there's an ongoing conversation between DCLG and the monitoring officers of all the Dorset councils about how this issue might progress. Whatever the outcome of that is will be in the structural change order, and then once that's made, clearly that would have to be then actioned. As Councillor Jones points out, there are parallels to some what we'd recognise as being normal council arrangements, but clearly this is a bit different again. So it's a shadow executive, not a cabinet, because clearly in a single council model, the cabinet would be selected by the leader, and the leader themselves would be selected by the majority group, and that model doesn't work in this circumstance. A cabinet obviously wouldn't be selected on a geographical basis, but the intention is that the shadow executive would, so there would be representatives from Christchurch, there would be representatives from Poole and representatives from Bournemouth. And as Councillor Jones points out, those members would be there to take actions to put in place a new council rather than to run portfolios as members of an executive for a council would normally be involved in. So I think the monitoring officers are trying to get to the point where it's as close and recognisable to elected members as it can be in terms of how that would work. But clearly you can't just pick up an existing council model and apply it in this instance.
Can I just come back? Sorry. Thank you, David. The only concern I was thinking about is if you take all the councillors, if they're all members, where do they all meet? Because you're talking about quite huge numbers, and I don't think any of us have got a committee room or a location where we can all fit in, surely.
Been a bit of discussion about how that might be done if it happens at all. So 120 members, I think it is. More of a challenge in the Dorset area should that be the model, where there's 211. So 120 members clearly is requires a big room, and it requires a room that's suitable in terms of equipment, acoustics, and all the rest of it, so that the meeting is clear and transparent and available to the public. That said, the shadow authority may not meet very often. So this is work in progress, but it's obviously got to meet initially to establish itself, to appoint the executive, to elect a chair, assuming there's going to be a chair, and those sorts of things. So almost like the annual meeting, as we would maybe understand it. And then it's imagined that it would certainly meet to approve the budget and set the council tax for the new council. But in the period between those two things, it's possible that the shadow executive can deal with most of the business that needs to be transacted. So whilst it would be a very large meeting, it may not actually take place very often in that period.
Somewhat ironically, the only chamber I can think of that can accommodate 120 odd councillors is the council chamber at the county council, when of course there were I think over 100 members when Bournemouth and Poole were part of that authority. So perhaps we'll all be taking trips to Dorchester. And are there any further questions on this point, on this matter? Can I?
Sorry, Mr. Chairman, I do have a general question about our representation, and it basically revolves around about the amount of money that we put in, the £80,000. And when I actually attended a meeting and someone did mention that Bournemouth and Paul put in £110,000, which in my book is about 40-odd thousand pounds more, say 50% more, but we don't seem to have 50% of the numbers that Bournemouth have on representation.
Chairman, if I could come back on that. Yes, our contribution is 80,000. Bournemouth and Paul's is not 110. I haven't got the figures there. It's significantly more than that. And they should be in the notes of the meeting that we had last time. No. No, Paul's not 110 either. If for the clarity, if I get my laptop, I'll find out what those numbers are and let you. Thank you, Chairman. If I could come back, and Nikki's helpfully found the information that we presented last time. Yes, our contribution is 80,000. Bournemouth is 635. Poole is 491. 491. Bournemouth 635. The county 686. East Dorset 144. North Dorset 115. Purbeck 75. West Dorset 164. Weymouth and Portland 106. So ours is second lowest contribution.
Excuse me, Mr. Chairman, if I may. If Dorset is 686, and they say that they do 75% of our administration or the revenue that which is supplied by the population of this council to Dorset, surely a contribution of that, their part of their contribution should be added to our contribution to equal up the numbers.
Thank you, Chairman. The contributions were based on population, not around representation or spend on budget.
Can I develop that a little further, please? The Dorset County Council effort is obviously mostly going to, because they are, I understand, the equivalent to the host authority for the rural Dorset. They are they will be, I understand, it is likely that they will be a continuing council, so they're going to continue in some sort of existence. But how, so is there just one pot into which everybody has kicked the money in, or is there one pot for the well, I would call it the Greater Bournemouth Council, and one for the Shire Dorset Council, or is it shared? Because some work is going to have to be done here for the County Council, and the County Council has members, although not full members, as is repeatedly pointed out on the committee. Is there any cash going into the pot for the Bournemouth, Christchurch and Poole Council from the County Council?
Thank you, Chairman. It started off as a single pot of 2.5 million, which was then apportioned, as I said, based on population. It's now two pots of money. in terms of the two joint committees are administering, or the programme boards are administering broadly 50% of that pot. Now, it would depend on the nature of the actual work that's undertaken as to who actually contributes to it.
So basically, there will be some contribution from the county council to the work in this area.
Potentially, it depends on that work and whether it is legitimately chargeable to the pot that the joint committee in the rural area control.
But surely, if we're talking about the work of the officers, like the head of democratic services, Matthew Wisdom, he's obviously going to be putting in some work that will be sending, even down at the level of sending the agendas to the two Dorset representatives. I would assume that in theory Dorset ought to pay for that.
No, there's a decision that's been made that it's only additional costs to councils that will actually be underwritten. So both councils are recruiting or have recruited things like programme managers. So that's where the money is actually being drawn down against those. So any work that's being done on disaggregation, where there are officers from several councils from both areas, there isn't a merry-go-round of charging for officer time to the different councils, because otherwise it would just end up in a circular loop of us charging you and you charging us.
This begins to look a little through a glass darkly. Councillor Mrs. Jones.
I'm sorry, Mr. Chairman, but am I right then in following these exchanges that Dorset Council pays nothing into the pot of BCP, even though they take part in the work of disaggregation?
Chairman, if I could just clarify, there was £2.5 million that all the councils decided to set aside. And that, as I said, was determined, their contributions was determined on the population for different areas. There are different work streams being undertaken for both councils, both joint committees. Some is unique to those joint committees, some will overlap. Where those costs overlap and there are additional costs to the costs that the councils already incur in administering general business, those would then be recharged.
I think I begin to see this. So this leads me on actually to another point that is coming up. Now, it says here there is the chief financial officer. And I believe that this is a gentleman from Mr. Richin, Service Director, and there is yourself. Obviously, you're involved in the financial side. What actually is the contractual position of these officers? Because it's my understanding that if an officer works for a council and that council gives a legitimate instruction to the officer, then that officer should carry out that instruction. Is there any possibility of a conflict of interests in that it might be said that people working for the joint committee may be given instructions by the joint committee which may run contrary to the instructions or the requests of their employing authority? So where exactly, yes, when time goes by and the interim authority is set, whatever it's called, the authority is set up, then I assume that it will have its own staff and they will be clearly working for that authority in the shadow executive. But at the moment, we have a shadowy phase whereby you have a joint committee that relies on the work of officers who are employed by the three individual councils. At what point, can it be said that, if I may put it this way, this council can, through the council, not, I accept it as option 4 authority, we as members have no executive power, but the council as a whole can instruct its officers. Is the joint committee in that position, or is it down in a position where it requests the officers to undertake a particular piece of work? Mr. McIntosh.
Yeah, Chairman, perhaps that's one for me rather than Ian. Obviously, it's an unusual set of circumstances. I think that's the first thing to say. But we've got a lot of experiences, both for you as members and us as officers, in working in partnership. And from an officer perspective, there are times when we find ourselves serving, in our case, 2 councils who haven't always taken the same approach to things. So we're well versed in responding to Christchurch Borough Council's needs and East Dorset's needs separately. Clearly, it's a happier situation when they're in tandem, but they're not always. And wider examples would be us, pursuing your policy decisions in terms of the Dorset Waste Partnership or the Stour Valley and Poor Partnership, and we would undertake work with our colleagues in those forum to further those aims. So the situation that we find ourselves in now is that this council made a policy decision to join the Bournemouth, Christchurch and Poole Joint Committee, and it has 2 representatives, our leader and deputy leader. So we, as officers, support the representatives on the joint committee as we would support any of your representatives on other groups. And so that engages us in the work of the joint committee in conjunction with other officers. And that's, for example, what Ian has been doing with Adam Richins from Bournemouth and Poole that you happen to mention. What we also do is pursue the policy of this council on other things or related things. So last week you had your extraordinary council meeting. You considered a very full and lengthy representation, which the initial draft of which had been produced by myself and Ian and some others. Once that representation was agreed, I drafted a letter for your leader to send it off to the Secretary of State, and we spent a good couple of days refining everything and making sure it all went off, and Councillor Jones, you helped us with the proofreading. So we worked on that together to make sure that your policy position was properly presented to the Secretary of State. So there are no issues from my perspective as the council's head of the paid service, and part of that, the main part of that responsibility is to allocate officer resources appropriately. We're well versed at dealing with sometimes conflicting situations. We're not civil servants, as you know, but maybe there's a sort of parallel there that they shift from one position to another when their job requires them to do that, and that's the way we work. And it happens to be because of the partnership that you've been in with East Dorset for a long time. We're pretty well versed and skilled in doing that, actually. So that would be my response. Things will change again, whatever the outcome of all of this happens to be, and we will always endeavour to support the council and its policy aims. I think it's important to recognise that your policy aims are to oppose local government reorganisation whilst choosing to be members of the joint committee, and your officers are responding accordingly.
Thank you very much for that. What is, I think, a concern might be, for the sake of argument, if the joint committee says we will release this information at such and such a time, which the officer may have been working on and may actually have the information. And if members of this council are then asked to see it, before the joint committee would like it seen, what is then the position of the officers involved? Because I did say, and I'm going back a long time now, that one problem might be is if, although it is possible that, and it is executable, if we say do this, East Dorset say do that, the officers are skilled enough to do the job because the authority boundaries do not overlap. But if the joint committee were to have made a request to an officer, please don't release, or the joint committee, as it did, accepted that the information should not be released. I think it was Mr. Brown that proposed it, though there was no seconder, that it should be released. If this members of this council then said, look, we'd like to see this information, how far is it valid to say, well, you don't have any executive powers, you can't instruct this information to be released, but which is, I suspect, within the parameters, it isn't ultra vires. But what concerns me is that you have the impression given that the joint committee said, do this, and the response was, I can't do this because I went to a request for information that I can't do this because the joint committee has said we don't want it released until such and such a time. Now that is all right. In the end, this conflict will resolve itself because there will be, or God forbid, there will be an interim authority. But in the meantime, there is, I think, a potential for a conflict of authorities.
I think, Chairman, that we shouldn't ignore the role of the two Christchurch Borough Council representatives on the joint committee in this respect. So the example that you're referring to, as I understand it, refers to the modelling work that's been done for council tax harmonisation. There is a task and finish group for that. Councillor Mrs Jameson's on that task and finish group and saw the papers that were being referred to. Now, it's not, if the joint committee made a decision not to release those papers, it's not for us to challenge that decision, I don't think. I think it would be for your representatives on the joint committee to do so. And if you wish to do that, we can aid you in that, just as Mrs Phipps will tell you that I've aided her in pursuing this issue around members being able to ask questions at the joint committee. And I was happy to do that on her and others' behalf. Successfully, thankfully. So we'll take issues up for you, but I think you need to look to your two representatives in order to challenge back on any point of the joint committee that you're not happy with.
I don't want to bog the committee down in this, but it is an important point that the leader in an option for council is primus inter pares. In other words, we as councillors haven't surrendered any authority to him. And if therefore we as a council or as councillors should ask an officer for information that is in the position of that officer, now there may well be perfectly legitimate reasons why that cannot be disclosed. As was pointed out to me, I think on my first day as a councillor, common with all the others, the fact that you're a councillor doesn't mean you can see everything. But we're here at the question of, we are asking for some information. The officer is coming back and saying, I can't give you this because the joint committee says so. And that is not, I fear, a terribly satisfactory solution. Yes, we can go through our representatives on the committee, that's fine. It is particularly annoying to find that there was an answer given back at some point to say, well, your representatives voted against the proposal that the work should be published. But that, to my mind, isn't the case. It's councillors asking for information that they feel would help them in their duties. It's if the only reason opposed to that is that the joint committee says it's not to be released, that to my mind is a little unsatisfactory.
Chairman, I'll have to comment, but I'm not sure I could say much more. I think the distinction I would make is that if we're dealing with Christchurch Borough issues, then Ian and I are both, as examples, employed to support the council and to support you as members. The Constitution allows for you to access information reasonably and for us not to unreasonably withhold it. There are the odd occasion where there's a legal or technical reason why officers have information that they can't disclose to members, but it's quite unusual. So that's our council's arrangement, quite rightly. The differentiation I would make is that Ian and I aren't employed by the joint committee, and the joint committee's information doesn't belong to us to give to you. It belongs to the joint committee, and if you want to access it, you have to ask the joint committee to do so. It might be that you choose to do that through us and through your representatives, but it's not for us automatically to give you that information.
I think I won't take the committee's time up by pursuing that further, because I think we could be here for quite some time on that. Councillor Hilliard.
Just another question on the decisions made at the on the point about the MTFP. So it's saying that the intention is to provide further update once the 2018-19 budgets have been prepared. Now, Mr. Mill, will those likely include our percentages, our proportions of the Dorset budget?
I'm sorry to interrupt, but could I ask for a very brief delay while my magic machine is reconnected to its source? Awesome. That's about to give Nikki a whole new meaning of the word tied up. Okay, Councillor Hilliard again.
So yeah, so will the update for 2018-19, will it include some, I know you'll carry on as normal, just looking at solely Christchurch, but will you also be doing some numbers in effect in preparation for de-aggregation of Dorset contributions and the funding gap?
Thank you, Chairman. Now, the 18-19 budgets will be sovereign council budgets. As the disaggregation work progresses and that work stream draws some conclusions, then there will be the opportunity to start to build the budgets for potentially the two new unitaries in 1920. But the 18-19 budgets will still be sovereign council budgets.
Thank you. And when do you think we would see the first draft of the 1920 budgets, including council tax harmonisation, de-aggregation, any other anomalies? Thank you.
I'm afraid I'm not sure yet.
Thank you. Are there any further questions on this point or points that members wish to raise? I think, would members feel it fair to say that there were concerns raised as to the flow of accountability, or the lines that I think military terms would be the chains of command, the flow of accountability? Can we ask the officer to get the right wording for that? Thank you. We're happy with that. Right, thank you very much. So we now move on to the next point. Having lost my place. And we are down onto disaggregation. Now, again, members, this is what I'm there for. So I will mention one or two points here. It is proving quite difficult to extract the information which we have been requesting. The cost of it's very possible to work out how much Christchurch has paid to Dorset. It does not seem to be, which I think is part 2, but part 1 is more difficult, and it seems that the county council's accounting system have not actually worked on this particular point, and that while it is possible to work out some idea of value of the assets that the county actually has, the physical buildings here and such like that, again, there's a question on that. Are they what it costs the county to get them? Are they what it could be if it was sold as an office block? What would it be if it's sold as building land? And there's a wide range there of problems. So that in itself is going to be a bit more difficult. But we need to know these points. And as far as I'm aware, we haven't yet had these questions were asked by our leader. Does the deputy leader know if we've had an answer to these as yet?
Disaggregation. Well, I don't think we've had anything back yet from county, but they are working on it. As you say, it's a very complicated process.
I can imagine that. Nonetheless, I think there is a concern, and this leads into the next point that I raised. My priority, both as a county councillor and as a representative here, is to ensure that the service users are not adversely affected, because at the end of this process, it's very easy to forget it's actually a real live person who is dependent on the services provided by the county council. Now these services, if this goes ahead, and I will continue to put in that caveat, if this goes ahead, then the provider of those services will change, or the authority for the provision of those services will change. It may be that it will be a simple change, say, from Kivenal care to Aging care. It may be a more complicated change. I'm a little bit disturbed to find out that this may include reassessments and so on, so that they people involved may not have a seamless transition. And I think Councillor Neil, you had some information on this.
That was one of my questions about, it says there's no guarantee. Specific care companies won't be continuing with their care. That means that whenever they change care companies, most of the disabled and people that are on that system have to be reassessed. And since some of them have been reassessed, some of the rules and things have changed. So I would think there could be, it's only my assumption, that there is a possibility that some will suffer some shortfalls or not even get what they've usually been used to getting.
It is my understanding that when an individual applies for or is granted a care package, that they are assessed by someone from the county council. In the case when my mother was finally had her arm twisted into asking for an assessment, she was visited by a county council officer who went through everything with her and came out, you need level X of care. Now, as I understand it, that assessment should be taken, if everything were to work smoothly, should be taken over by should be taken in good faith by the new authority. In other words, Bournemouth, Christchurch and Poole, or whatever it is, should accept the level of care, the assessment that was given by the Dorset County Council. Does anybody happen to have any information as to whether this is what is intended? Or I know this is something we should ask, and it may be something that we should submit as a question for next week, as an ongoing point to raise. Does anybody have any thoughts on this matter? Councillor Mrs. Jones.
I do know, Mr. Chairman, that a number of people in Christchurch are concerned that if they are under a new authority, they will lose the continuity, because some people have had the same carers for 20 years and they're frightened because obviously they're used to their carers, they're used to the way they work, there's a relationship between them that is important to the care of that individual. And a number of people want explained to them what is going to happen, because they feel they're going to be given other care packages, other carers, other caring authorities. And as we know through experience, it can vary. We have known care packages which have stipulated times. This is the time for breakfast, this is the time for washing, this is the time you'll be visited for lunch, for tea. And what has happened is that lunch and breakfast have been almost merged. Somebody has come for breakfast 2 hours, 3 hours late, and the next one has arrived on time for lunch, but the poor individual being dealt with hasn't got an appetite because they've only just finished breakfast, and with similar arrangement problems arising during the day. So you've got a lot of worried people, and I think somewhere along the line some of these questions are going to have to be answered, because we're dealing with vulnerable people who rely on carers more than families. The carer is, if you like, in loco parentis, in loco family, and there is a bond, and they fear that this bond will be broken.
Very much. Any comments on Councillor?
I was just going to support everything there that Councillor Mrs. Jones has said. Lots of people have come to me and said similar words. Some people having been put to bed at sort of 4:30 in the afternoon for the evening, you know.
Is it the committee's wish then that we include in our comments a note about the concern that the transition may not be as smooth as possible, that it will be important to retain providers where they can, and this is something that really does need thorough investigation? Okay, thank you. Now, there is one point, or a further point on this that leads in that, again, that if, again, from the County Council's point of view, and from my point of view, perhaps the biggest and most crucial service that the County Council provides, and I know we have a lot of debate about how much value the County Council, how much in the cost the County Council provides and so on, but the service that is most felt by people, I think, is social care. Now, it may be that this is going to move more and more into health, which I think was a subtle hint in the yesterday's reshuffle, that you don't make somebody Minister for Social Care unless he's going to be doing an awful lot with regard to social care, and it may be that this will vanish off local authority agendas altogether. Until that point, it is something that the council has got to get right. Now, we've heard a lot about how it is expected by the supporters of the Future Dorset scheme that this scheme will enable savings to be made sufficient to allow care to continue. But that means that they've got to get the finances right. And this is where and if they don't get it right, then it's going to be vulnerable people who will suffer. Now, one point that I think is worth stating on account of certain correspondence that's been going around is that the county council leader has actually said that Dorset is not relying on local government reform to enable it to resolve its position. But whatever happens, that might happen over that side, but we've got to make sure, as far as we can, that the financial position this side is as stable as we can. And this is where I think we may find that things get a little passionate, because we're going to be looking at council tax harmonisation. Now, at this point, Dr. Al Roger has, I have asked to come and speak to us tonight. He has done an awful lot of work on the finances of this, the financial projections, starting with the work of local partnerships onwards. And it may be that he might have something to contribute to our discussions. Is it your wish, members, that we invite him to come to the table and participate? Is there any opposition? Thank you very much. That is unanimous. Dr. Rogers, would you like to join us, and perhaps you could tell us something about yourself and your expertise in this work? I do know that, speaking as somebody mathematically who still has the gravest doubt that 2 + 2 = 4, and I'm not totally skilled in that field, but perhaps you would be able to tell us about your expertise.
Right, well, I'm an engineer by trade originally. I'm in the mathematical side of it, carrying out quite complex analyses of things mechanical, but that has drifted into sort of slightly more general things. I ended up more in production control, production management, operations management systems. So carrying out analyses like looking at something like the local partnerships modelling is pretty small beer for me, and I don't really think it is, perhaps, given that you're discussing the joint committee takes on board the idea that there is the possibility of a super council to be produced, to become possible, and that the idea is to enable that, not to second guess the justification of that decision. However, there are still a few justification question marks going on. My worry perhaps is that the justification has left some spectres at the feast, and that is preventing people from producing understandings of numbers. They are dodging numbers, if you like, particularly at the meeting of the joint committee. It got to the point with council tax harmonisation where there was talk of the savings from a super council being £10.3 million in year 10, that actual figure was not mentioned in that particular it was in the paragraph in the papers, but it wasn't actually mentioned at the meeting. And in that same paragraph is a quantification of the losses due to council tax harmonisation of 8.4 million, leaving you a grand total saving of £1.9 million. These numbers are not being articulated, and they weren't articulated at the meeting, and I find that a bit worrying. There was supposed to be a report, for instance, to the Secretary of State, whether or not he is being informed of these levels of savings. Just the point that harmonisation is not a permanent impediment. It is purely when the times are difficult, having harmonised, while you need the money, it is not there. That is the problem. It's an awkward situation. Once the money becomes easier, then you can then of course raise the council tax and regain the loss. But in the short term, when you have this constraint, you are losing the vast majority of the savings from a super council. Perhaps the other thing is that we are also still relying on the local partnerships analysis. This does contain evidently problems, and we are just assuming that when we, for instance, revisit these local partnerships and come up with a figure of £10.3 million, that is well established as a number, and I'm not entirely happy about that the 10.3 million is not necessarily the best analysis, and it's not being reassessed. So I say that is the problem with the general idea of it. I also perhaps pick up the idea that there is still this lasting belief, perhaps, by people who are wanting to see and have been backing the future Dorset scheme for some time, that the super council will provide a land of milk and honey in the future, but of course the savings are not that great, given that you are talking about a very large council with a gross spend of £800 million or so. £10 million savings is not a great deal. And looking at, for instance, the medium-term financial plan figures that were being put forward there, you were seeing, okay, they are future savings required, but the future savings required in the first year of the super council and the second year of the super council were coming out at something like £10 million a year each year. So that's £20 million over the first 2 years. Added to that, of course, there will be the cost of enabling super council, and really we are relying on that harmonisation to get us through this difficult period, because after it, if the hard times continue, we will have no savings. So it's really is a sort of a one-shot job, and the worry perhaps is that the decisions are being made, for instance, within this harmonisation committee, which are binding the hands of someone trying to enable a super council to work with harmonisation costs, and I don't believe these are being considered properly. Those are my general worries.
Thank you very much. I suspect Mr. Milner would wish to come back on this. First, so I wonder, we've got quite a lot of pretty information on the back of the paper 9, which was just produced, which I think is quite relevant. Unfortunately, I didn't print it on the colour printer, so mine's not quite 50 Shades of Grey, but you get the idea. Councillor Jamieson, would you like to talk us through where we are actually with this harmonisation?
Chairman, thank you. The last meeting, we did have some models put in front of us. These varied from, I think, 20 years down to virtually nothing. The only problem is that all the time they are talking about so many years. Now the years have come down from 20 years down to 10 or 7 years. I'm afraid I argued the whole way through. Well, I'm not afraid I argued the whole way through. I did argue it the whole way through that Christchurch is only interested in harmonisation from day one. And we don't seem to be able to get any figures for that. I think because the figures won't add up. We are sticking for that, and I don't know quite where we're going to go. At the end of the meeting, it was decided that we didn't make arrangements for another meeting because really and truly we can't do an awful lot until we know what this year's budgets are going, or next year's budgets are going to be, and also disaggregation. So it's all sort of on hold at the moment.
So just to clarify, it really is a matter of very great importance that we find what the costs of disaggregation are going to be. But did I not see some suggestion that this might not be available until the summer of 2018?
I don't think that came through our committee. There is another task and finish group dealing with disaggregation, and I don't know where they are because I'm not on that task and finish.
Well, I think, members, that might be something we would like to stress, how that these figures are vital. We must get these figures. Is that your wish that we should put that forward? Thank you. And I can't say in the blue corner or the red corner because that would give allegations of political partiality, but Mr. Milner.
Thank you, Chairman. First of all, I'd just like to come back on the local partnerships. It's obviously received quite a bit of attention ever since it was done, the work. But I would point out that, that work was validated by all the chief finance officers in Dorset. It was scrutinised by PwC, one of the biggest accountancy firms in the country. It was produced by professional financial people from the Treasury and also scrutinised by DCLG. And none of those have considered that the information that's presented is either invalid or doesn't portray the picture that the chief finance officers put forward in terms of the business case. The second point I'd make is in terms of the savings, the £28 million across Dorset, of which 10 is attributed to the Bournemouth, Christchurch and Poole area, is really the first phase. Clearly the opportunities of savings from a unitarisation are significant, and PwC pointed out they could be in the realms of 66 million. So in terms of the modelling that local partnerships done, that only represents basically the first phase, and that is about the rationalisation of the workforce, not necessarily transformation. So in terms of the modelling, there are and could be further significant savings that could take place. Just picking up on a point that Councillor Jameson made in terms of the modelling, there is harmonisation for day one included in there. So there's a model in there that does do that. In terms of actually just talking numbers and responding to the position around council tax harmonisation will wipe out what was potentially a favourable position, again, I'll refer to the local partnerships position, the cumulative position that they forecast in 24-25 for Bournemouth, Christchurch and Poole area was a cumulative surplus over the period to 24-25 of 45 million. The council tax foregone at that point with a 20-year harmonisation was 5.6 million. With the shorter harmonisation period based on the resolution of the joint committee of a 7-year period, that council tax foregone would increase to 21 million. So a movement of 15-16 million. So that still leaves a net cumulative surplus of £30 million based on the local partnerships work. And as I said before, that
Sorry, Mr. Milner, did you say 13 or 30?
30.
30, thank you.
And as I said earlier, that is based on just the first phase of savings. So the opportunities and the savings are still there, even with a shorter council tax harmonisation period. The savings are not wiped out.
Thank you. before we go ask for any comment back on that, are there any members who would like to comment or ask questions? Either Mr. Milner or Dr. Roger. Councillor Hilliard.
Thank you. It's just an observation, obviously, looking at the decisions made. So on the one hand, on page 9 at the top, it says no council taxpayer will see an increase greater than the government's referendum limit and therefore pay no more than they would have done prior to LGR. And then 2 points down is say that it was decision made that council taxpayers in Christchurch area see a freeze or reduction. And what I can't get my head round is that and I listened to the joint committee, the 15th online, and the two, in effect, stumbling blocks of the committee, the big headaches I see it are Christchurch and the tax harmonisation, Christchurch and deaggregation. And I don't know if Mr. Milner, if you've got an idea, why do Bournemouth and Poole want us if we're such a big headache financially? We're going to, I know potentially the savings will come on stream in 24-25, but up until then, harmonisation is a major cost, deaggregation is a major cost. How do they get the benefit in the long term from us?
Thank you, Chairman. Yeah, the savings don't come online in 24-25. They will start in 19-20. So that's that first point. I think we need to go back to the actual case for change to look at the wider picture in terms of the opportunities for the actual conurbation. And the Chief Exec might want to add some of those. I think that's what the incentive is in terms of the councils for Dorset. They do see that there are financial benefits, but there are a number of other benefits that the unitaries could provide the catalyst for, and they are set out in the work that the PwC did.
Just another minor, while we're on the harmonisation, our leader asked a question about ethical equality, and I don't think there was an answer given at the time. Is there a case there or not?
That particular question was asked at this council, and the monitoring officer at that time, Sophia Narty, responded to say there wasn't.
One question, either Mr. Milner or of our deputy leader. On page 11, the Poole council member noted, this is 11 at the bottom. A Poole council member moved that detailed workings considered by the task and finish group, notes of the working and reasons be provided to the joint committee. This motion was not seconded, and the chairman confirmed that it was already the intention to provide this information. Forgive me for asking, but is the information which is referred to that in paper 9 for next week?
Yes, it is, Chairman.
So all the information about harmonisation that was considered by the committee and so on, the detailed workings, the notes of the workings are all there. I haven't had time to look through the paper in detail.
Thank you, Chairman. As Councillor Jameson hopefully will confirm, is that the paper that is presented to the Joint Committee on the 15th is the paper that was discussed at the Task and Finish Group.
I can confirm that, thank you.
Throughout this process, many people have felt that perhaps not all the information has been provided promptly. This paper would have to have, assuming that Bournemouth have the same sort of cycle as we have, this paper would have reached its present stage something like 10 days ago?
No, it didn't, Chairman. Clearly there was a lot of requests for the information, and I personally have been raising that with members of the Task and Finish group about the need for sharing that information, the transparency, and going back to an earlier point about going back to the joint committee and the Task and Finish group to enable that to be shared. I had a discussion with the chair of the Task and Finish group last week, Thursday, Friday, at which point I was advised that I could share the information, and then I actually wrote the report at the weekend and confirmed its accuracy on Monday morning when it was actually presented.
So this was actually produced by you Friday, Saturday, Sunday, and validated by Mr. Beasley Councillor Beasley, Monday, and then sent out by you.
Correct. I wrote the report on Sunday, circulated it Sunday night, possibly Monday. I circulated it to the Task and Finish group for their comments and the chief execs, and once I'd had those comments, I finalised the report and asked it to be published.
Thank you. So you obviously drew together quite a bit of information. Do we know when this information would it have been possible had the chairman of the Task and Finish group agreed to have provided this information earlier?
This information was presented to members at the Task and Finish group, which includes Councillor Jameson, on the 21st of November.
On the 21st
of November, which is when the Task and Finish group met immediately after the November Joint Committee.
Well, members, I have to say that for something that affects all of us and affects this process very, very deeply, for the life of me, I cannot see any good reason why this information was not circulated on the 22nd of November.
I can probably answer that. The Task and Finish group reports to the main joint committee, and I think that is probably why the details weren't put out in the open before then, because it is a task. The Task and Finish group can't make the decision. They can only put an idea in front of the main group or the main committee.
Though it is still then a matter of regret if this could have been published and made available to members and members of the public on the 15th, that it wasn't. And as I have said, I remarked at the time that the use of Task and Finish groups was, although possibly it was said to be inevitable, might tend to lead that there was a delay in information getting to the public. I accept and I compliment Mr. Milner on being able to work over the weekend to get this done. But as I said, I'm a little bit concerned about the delay in getting the information out. Anyway, that's fair enough. Is there any further point on this? On council tax harmonisation? I have one or 2 points. Councillor Jameson, you're looking like you're ready to pounce.
No, I'm not ready to pounce, Chairman. I'm sort of saying, really and truly, I can see why. I mean, I know very well why we have Task and Finish groups, because we could not possibly cover all the work in the time with the whole committee. So we have to, and the Task and Finish groups only look at the outside of the things, report back for the main committee to make the decisions, and this is why they're not open to the public, etc.
Councillor Mrs. Jones.
Mr. Chairman, while I can accept that, what I don't understand is that when we attended the meeting in December and the committee was told about tax harmonisation, we were actually hearing it at second hand because Councillor Beasley had already made a statement to the press. So a few days before, we had read that great things were in store for Christchurch residents. It was just before our referendum, I think the day before, 2 days before, that, you know, it would bring about great changes. So while I can accept Councillor Jamieson's view that it is up to the Task and Finish group to report to the committee, what I can't accept is that before that, the chairman does in effect a shortened version for the benefits of the press and the world at large. The two don't work together.
That's a fair point. That is, I think, verging into a political point, which it's not fair to ask the officers to comment on. But we are all politicians with a small p, in that we're engaged in the political process. And I have to say that the timing of Councillor Beasley's announcement was significant. It's unfortunate that he's not here to answer for himself, but that might be something we might wish to do. You never know. I'll leave that till Councillor Jamieson's back. Are there any other comments before we ask? I'm going to ask, I think, Mr. Milner and then Mr. Rogers Dr. Rogers to get it right, Dr. Roger to sum up, and then I think we'll have to try and draft a comment to the committee. I am going to have to call an adjournment for 2 minutes till I get out there and turn the lights off in the car, so otherwise I shall have a very flat battery. And anybody who needs a comfort break can take it. Councillor Hilliard.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I actually have to leave the meeting now. Apologies.
Thank you very much for coming.
Just to summarise, as is pointed out in the report that's going to the Joint Committee on Monday, the modelling that has been done to date will now be superseded because of the changes to the referendum limits in the local government settlement. So that work will need to be revisited. So members do need to bear in mind that the information that has been circulated, to some extent is out of date. As soon as we know the council tax levels that are being set by our council, Dorset County Council, Bournemouth and Poole, then that remodelling can be done because there are some flexibilities for the upper tier councils in 18, 19 and 19, 20, particularly how they spread their adult social care precepts. So we do need to wait for that to come forward.
Dr. Rogers, any comment to make to wind up?
Just perhaps to say that I strongly disagree with the comment that there is no problems with the local partnership numbers, particularly the number was mentioned, £45.3 million as the savings. It was produced as an annual saving in the consultation. It's described here as a cumulative saving. It is actually a corruption of the two and therefore a nonsense value. And that is one of the problems with the local partnership report. It is full of stuff like that. So I cannot recognise, for instance, the PricewaterhouseCoopers, they made a point of saying they do not check the local partnerships numbers, they just repeat them. And their £66 million was transformation costs that were not necessarily anything to do with creating super councils.
Mr. Milner, if you'd like to come back.
Yes, thank you, Chairman. Clearly, I, along with my colleagues, were closely involved in working alongside local partnerships, and we would not have let the figures go forward to councils, to DCLG, to PwC, who did actually look at the numbers, because again, I worked closely with PwC, without being confident that they were robust.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Roger, for coming and talking to us and for helping us with this. And I think, thank you, Mr. Milner, for coping with that. Can I just ask one question, please? I believe you had either a meeting or a correspondence with Mr. Rousel of DCLG in October, was it, regarding the time limits that the government was imposing on the harmonisation process?
Yes, there was a meeting in Poole, and the chief exec was at that meeting, which Mr. Rousel attended, and there were, they did give us an indication of their expectations around council tax harmonisation.
And just to correct my understanding, the meeting was in October, towards the end of October? Ish.
If you continue with the meeting, I probably can find out in my diary exactly when it was.
The interesting thing is, of course, that on the morning of the 7th of November, Mr. Rousel had a meeting with our MP following discussions with the Secretary of State the night before, and Mr. Chope was informed that the DCLG, or as Mr. Rousel said, that the absolute limit that the government was contemplating was 5 years, and it was, if my memory serves me right, a limit of 2 years had been the longest that had been allowed in previously, and it could be as low as 1 year or nothing at all. Now, obviously, if you were told this in October and Mr. Chope was told this in November, there's time for duckleg to DCLG, what we've got to call them now, DHCLG, to have changed its position. Do we have any firm update on what they would consider a tolerable harmonisation period, or is it? And I understand that the Dorset committee is working towards no harmonisation, day one harmonisation. So again, this is very important.
Yes, Chairman. I found the note of the meeting. It was the 17th of October last year. And the two key points were that Mr. Rouser said a 20-year harmonisation period would not be acceptable, despite us going to London when the 20-year harmonisation period was being discussed and them not disputing that, or actually directing us in that towards 20 years. He also said a maximum period of 10 years would be, but expectation would be to do it as soon as possible. And we've received no other advice other than that, and so that's the advice we're giving to the joint committees.
So again, somewhere along the line, and it's not this time, well, it's not anybody's fault locally, DHCLG are not being, are not got their ducks in a row, as one might say. If you're saying to you 10 years on the 17th of October and they're saying to Mr. Chope, 5 years absolute maximum, would we like it a lot lower, if none at all, on the 7th of November, then that's counter order and disorder. Are there any further comments on this point before we try and pull something together? Would anybody like to go at pulling together our discussions? Councillor Abbott.
Could we just rewind on a small point? I missed my cue there. It's on page 6, 5 and 6. Easier to look on the first paragraph of 6. Shadow authority established. Chief Finance Officer highlights to the shadow authority decisions which will have either a significant financial impact or involve significant financial risk exposure. Can we be absolutely certain that significant becomes a firm figure? Because significant could mean anything, as we've seen before in various other situations.
Can you assist, Mr. Milner?
There has been discussions about trying to pinpoint a figure, but clearly, given the scale of the unitaries compared to the districts, they consider, what we would possibly consider as significant as not as significant. So we weren't ever able to actually pinpoint a specific figure. I think we were in the realms of 500,000, whereas 500,000 in terms of some of the risk and exposure to unitaries is not as significant to them as it would be to us. So I think it's really down to the Section 151 officers to actually understand what the commitment might be for the new unitary of a decision that existing councils make, and to alert members to that.
Thank you very much. Are you happy with that, Councillor Abbott?
Can we be sure they're going to end with a firm figure? We don't want any of these elastic goalposts.
There won't be a firm figure.
Right, ladies and gentlemen, we really need to move towards some sort of conclusion on this point. I think it's fair to say that we note that there is a difference of opinion on the effect of council tax harmonisation, the savings recorded, and as I never tire of saying, both Mr. Pickles for the Conservatives and Sir Eric Pickles, as I should now say, and Mr. Miliband for Labour have admitted that every unitary's cost more and saved less than was forecast. So I think it's fair to say that we're concerned about the figures, that we note that there is a difference of opinion. I think it's fair to say that would members agree that it is absolutely vital that we get the information about the cost of disaggregation as soon as possible. Councillor Abbott.
It's just a little point, but I keep seeing the word assumptions thrown up at us. And I'd just like to remind people an assumption is actually a kind of a guess. We've already seen the assumptions already been disproved from 2016. So I think when we see that word, we need to remember that it's not a firm figure.
I think that's a fair point. I think it was an assumption that people of Christchurch rather liked the idea of union with Bournemouth, and it's proved somewhat different. Councillor Mr. Jones?
Point, Mr. Chairman. I see that assumption is still carried forward by Councillor Janet Abbott.
No.
Sorry, no. Apologies, Councillor Janet Abbott. Councillor Janet Walton, who still seems to think that Christchurch is all in favour of a greater unitary. And I find it somewhat disturbing that she doesn't see that an 84% return in a referendum shows the people. But I would, just before we finish, like to ask the question which I think came up at the last meeting. At any point on this committee or series of committees, have they accepted the terms on which we said Christchurch would join? I think that's possibly for Councillor Jameson.
I could help and say that a number of the points on which we joined the committee have been accepted by and large, to the point, I think, even though there may be a slight variation, I think that could be acceptable. But there is, of course, one very large hairy elephant in the room. Councillor Jameson. Not that you're a large hairy elephant. I don't mean that at all. Apologies.
Harmonisation. Yes, they have accepted that we will only accept harmonisation from day one. So I think, yes, they have accepted the terms on which we have joined the committee. And I still think it's important that we are there.
Yeah. I think that it may be that council might want to review its position, because unless, as I understand it, would it be fair to say that the rest of the committee is not terribly enthusiastic about day one harmonisation?
That would be very true.
At which point, as it is our stated policy, and it doesn't seem as if it's going to happen, or that the other authorities are not keen on it happening, then and also having seen the way that the committee operates, and I could think of a number of descriptions from history and the way that it operates, but it may be time in due course, and it's not for us to decide, that council might want to look at its position again. But that's for another day, but that's a fair point. And thank you very much, Councillor Jameson. And can I add in here, as we're moving towards I think we've done all the financial bit, can I thank you very, very much indeed for coming in. I know that you've just got back and you must still be jet lagged and somewhat shocked by the frozen atmosphere. And thank you very much for coming to speak to us. Please feel free to stay for the rest of the meeting if you wish. Thank you. Are there any further points? So, okay, we need to say that there's, we notice that there are differences of opinion. We think it's absolutely important that we get the disaggregation costs right. Would members wish to say that we stress again that this council's policy is for a day one harmonisation, and day one harmonisation means day one, not day two onwards, but it means day one. Would that be fair?
I think you need to emphasise that. Yeah. The other thing I'm still totally confused over, the money that comes to Dorset, well, goes to Dorset County Council for our population that are they're doing the services for our roads, our schools, and everything else. That money must come back to Christchurch eventually, or go into the new council. I don't seem to see that allocated anywhere. The medium-term financial sheets only do the situation as they are today, with us taking what we're told is 11% or something of the money that comes to us. It doesn't directly come to us, it goes straight into county. So I'm just a little bit concerned. There's a huge amount of money to going into county, 75% or whatever of the money that is attracted by the residents of Christchurch to pay for those services. So it is important that we get that amount. We need to know what that amount is.
I would completely agree with that. Can I come back in a second? That it is important. We must know these figures. We know how much goes from Christchurch to Dorset County Council through Precept. What we don't know, and it's very interesting because a former leader of this council was very fond of saying that far more goes out than comes in and is spent here, but when we're trying to quantify that, there don't seem to be the figures. So we do need to know the figures. Mr. Milner.
Thanks, Chairman. I was just going to confirm it's about £24 million in terms of council tax. Now, you know, as you point out, the medium-term financial plans that have been reported to the Joint Committee present the as-is position, but the local partnerships doesn't. That includes, you know, the flow of cash as a result of a change.
Can I just make one point for clarification? As I understand it, we will pay over a precept in the year if this goes ahead. From 2018 to 19, this Borough Council will pay over a precept as we have done before. On the 1st of April, the existing councils will be dissolved, but it won't be the case that the county still has some money that should be paid to Christchurch, because that will all have gone through in the year. Am I correct?
In terms of council tax, you are correct. You know, there'll probably still be some toing and froing of disaggregation of the balance sheets and things like that will need to take place.
Okay, thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. So I think we've got the points down that we wanted to raise, and I think that again there's concern. I think that would it be fair to add that we need that information as a matter of principle should be passed to members, as passed out and publicised as soon as possible. I would say that I am concerned that the use of task and finish groups might be perceived by somewhat cynical people to be a way of circumventing the provisions of the various local government acts that say meetings must be held in public unless there's a good reason otherwise. And that might be something that our MP would like to look at in the future. But that's for another day. So are we happy about that? So we now move on to just two more to go. The structural change order. Again, are there any comments here? There is one point I will bring up, and I'm sorry that having said to Councillor Jameson she could go home out of the back to the warmth. I shouldn't be saying this now, but as I understand it, the group, this task and finish group, is going to recommend that the election of the executive be an indirect election as opposed to an election by the 120 members of the existing councils. And again, this is moving into the smoke-filled room syndrome. We don't want it open to everybody else, and I'd like to commend our leader for voting against that, and I think it's worthwhile putting in that we believe that there should be as much openness as possible, and we are unhappy about any indirect elections or self-perpetuating elites. Okay, anything else on that? One other point here, which is I think it actually moved back to the mayoralties. Perhaps the Chief Executive can help me on this one. I understand, and I could well be wrong, that Poole and Bournemouth are thinking in terms of continuing their mayoralties through a system of charter trustees. The cost of these charter trustees would then be a charge on the whole council, on the whole authority. If we go down the route, as I'd be very frank and say I hope we do, of a town council, if this, God forbid, comes to pass, and we choose a mayor, the cost of the mayoralty will be a cost to our mayoralty will be a cost through the town council to Christchurch. Is that correct? So we would in effect be paying for our own mayor and also a share of the mayoralty of Poole and Bournemouth. Wonderful. Sorry? Yes, exactly. And I think that might be a concern as well. Are there any other points on that? Electoral arrangements. Again, as I understand it, when it says bespoke arrangements for Dorset, does that mean bespoke arrangements for both the Shire Unitary and the Greater Bournemouth Unitary? We're on page 13 at the bottom, item 35. And I think 1, 2, 3, 4 lines down, he explained that a full review would take 16 to 18 months, but bespoke arrangements for Dorset would require work to be done quickly to enable the review to be conducted and completed. So would this bespoke arrangement be for the Shire, the Unitary, or both? I have heard it suggested that one sort of fairly quick and dirty solution would be to use the county council divisions and elect 2 members for each. Mr. McIntosh?
The arrangement would be for both. And for the Bournemouth Christchurch Pool area, there has to be a boundary review because there's no sort of fallback position because of the different nature of the constituent councils now. In the Dorset area, it's theoretically possible to have a sort of fallback position, a sort of holding pattern whilst the boundary review was done in full, but that's not the desire of the Joint Committee. There's quite a strong feel there that in order to create a new council, a very important part of that is to create a new governance framework, and that would include a full boundary review. So that work is underway there. Richard Jones happens to be leading on that work in the Dorset area. So there will be a full boundary review in both of the potential unitary areas in the lead up to the creation.
Thank you. Are there any comments on that? Okay. And that, I think, unless anybody's going to get involved. Oh yes, one small point. I was not allowed to vote on item 2 to continue the work at 12.2, and therefore the only point where I was able to ask that my dissent be registered from this was when we voted on 12.1, so that's why I dissented from that point.
Chairman, can I just, for the purpose of the minutes, make it clear that you were there as a county councillor?
Yes, I was there as a county councillor, which is why I wasn't able to vote on the other 2 points. But members knowing me may wonder why I dissented from that. So if you like, that's a personal statement of my action. And I don't suppose anybody's got any comments on the forward plan. Right, anything else? Councillor Abbott.
I just remembered something I was asked a while back. If they're going to dissolve all the councils and form a completely new council, yeah? Completely new council. We get it all set up with tax harmonisation, etc. What happens if the new council has different ideas?
I understand that the decisions on council tax harmonisation, council tax owes and the budget will be set by the shadow council or the shadow body, whatever it's called, and that I think would legally have to be done by the full 120 members of the authority, which will be very interesting for whoever's acting as chief executive, because they'll have to read out 120 names several times over and ask yay or nay. But once that has been done, I don't believe that it would be competent for the new authority to change around and say, actually, we're going to set it so that everybody, now that we have our electoral mandate, we will say that everybody in the whole unitary authority pays the same council tax from, it would have to be 1st of April 2020. But everything else that the interim authority does, apart from the electoral arrangements, again, in theory, the new authority could say, we don't like these and we want another boundary review, but that would be, I think, asking for trouble, because the boundary commission could say, well, we've just done it. But in certain things, the new authority's hands will be tied by the 120 councillors who make up the outgoing councils. But from then on, the new authority will have all the powers of a normal authority. Am I correct on that, Mr. McIntosh?
Can I just check, was a question in relation to the council tax harmonisation strategy particularly, or was it a more general question? Councillor Abbott.
Well, that was the particular question, but behind it was the idea of decisions being made by the shadow authority, the shadow committee, whoever that would be, and whoever elects them or whatever. Yeah.
Okay, so just to clarify, again, the shadow authority will be the members of the constituent councils, all 124 of you, 120 of you, sorry, 24 from this council and your opposite numbers from Poole and Bournemouth. The council tax harmonisation strategy is being, as you know, developed by both of the joint committees, and that's to inform CLG as to what a workable arrangement might be. And ultimately that will end up in a finance order, which will be part of the process of making the orders to create the new council and all its the functions it needs to and the decisions it needs to make. So CLG are very keen to put in place council tax harmonisation strategies that meet the requirements of the joint committees, whatever the joint committees come up with. But ultimately it will be in the order, so it's ultimately a matter for the Secretary of State. He needs to be satisfied that the strategy is deliverable. It's an interesting point that if something, then so that would set the strategy, and the new council would then be bound by that order. It's an interesting point as to if something happens and that strategy is no longer appropriate, how the councils manage that. But I guess they'd have to deal with that at the time. Would be dissimilar to each council now having to deal with unforeseen financial changes and the like. So that's the way the harmonisation strategy would be set, and it would it would bind the new council to that strategy, and they would have to cope with it accordingly. In a more general sense, clearly the shadow authority will start, no doubt, you know, in the latter part of this year, you'd imagine, to start to shape the thinking around what the new council would be like. But ultimately, that's for the members who would be elected in May 2019 to do that visioning work, to create the corporate plan, to talk about what sort of council it wants to be and what its priorities are. So I would imagine that would be the way it would work, just as it works now for this council.
Yeah, thank you.
Is there anything else, members? Councillor Neil.
Well, I know we'll go through the boundary changes or review. Who's actually in charge of those boundary? I know the boundary commission is in the end, but is it being run by the councils as they are now, or the new council?
I think that's one for Mr. McIntosh.
So what's happened so far is the conversation between the essentially joint committees and DCLG has identified that it is desirable or necessary to have a full boundary review in both areas. The Boundary Commission don't get involved in any of that until such time as the structural change order is made, because that's in terms of how they are set up, that's a constraint upon them. So because time is short, and this is an important piece of work, what DCLG have asked the councils to do through the joint committee is to come up with the information, and it's referred to in the minutes, that provides the evidence base for that boundary review to be conducted. So come the day if we get to that point where the structural order is made, all the early work has been done, and then that would allow the Boundary Commission then to be engaged, because the as you'll know, appreciate, that it's the Boundary Commission that then determine the warding arrangements, the number of wards, etc. There has to be a fallback position. So just to be clear on this, because there'll be stuff coming through the joint committee quite soon on this. CLG are insistent, and they've done this elsewhere, that there's a fallback position, because let's say something happens and the boundary review can't be completed in time. That would obviously mean that the councils couldn't hold their elections in May 2019. And don't ask me what would happen next. So there has to be a fallback position. And so in the structural change order, it will state what the total number of members should be for each of the new unitary areas. So that in that event, and an unlikely event, everyone would be working to avoid that, it would be the worst possible case scenario, I think, because we talk about having good governance and the importance of getting this right from day one. So the fallback position would have to be established. The number that will of members for the Bournemouth Christchurch pool area, which will be put to the joint committee in a special meeting at the end of January, is likely to be 76. And there's a rationale for that, which Richard Jones would be able to explain much better than me. As I say, that is the fallback position. It may ultimately not be the number that the boundary review produces. I can't imagine it be wildly out, because there's obviously been some thinking put in about how to establish that number. So that's why it's been done the way it is, full boundary review, but with this fallback position just in case of something unforeseen.
Just to ask one question then. You said earlier that there couldn't be the fallback position of the using the county council divisions, and I appreciate that wouldn't work for Bournemouth and Poole. No, there must be somewhere along the line some idea of what they were. So what would happen if that were the case? What would happen with regard to wards, or would they couldn't possibly elect all 76 members?
Yeah, I can't answer that question because it's the fallback position. With DCLG understandably insistent that a number goes in. There would have to be, if the boundary review for some reason failed, there would have to be a quick piece of work done and to get as close to things like electoral equality as is possible, but using existing warding boundaries and the like. It'd be far from ideal, and that's why nobody's advocating it. It's just one of these sort of situations that DCLG want to allow for, as I say, in unforeseen circumstances.
Like another general election, perhaps?
Well, anything might happen, and clearly there's no intention. If this all goes ahead, there's no intention that we end up in that situation, because this is a really important part, isn't it, of creating something that's new, giving the councillors and the council the best possible chance to have a successful start. And the last thing we need to be doing is trying to sort of fiddle about with electoral quality numbers to make something fit. So I don't anticipate we'll end up in that situation, but none of us have a crystal ball, do we?
Well, I think that's fair comment. Is there any other business that anything else members would wish to raise? Well, can I thank Mr. Milner and Mr. McIntosh for attending. I did think it might be an interesting meeting. So thank you very much, and I'm sure we could record that for the officers' contributions. Thank you, members, and it now looks as if we'll be meeting again, possibly rather sooner than we would otherwise be if there was a special meeting. So we'll need to. We have an ordinary scrutiny meeting on the 30th, which may be able then to incorporate the special meeting.
Can't recall I've got a date for the special meeting, but I'll check, Chairman, and let you know as soon as I can.
With your permission, members, I'll liaise with Lee on that. No, not yet. Thank you very much for your time, and we'll meet again later this month.